So this science class is going to do about risk analysis in food microbiology. It's very important to understand right from the start. Risk analysis takes many forms. It's not just microbial hazards, it's any sort of hazard. And really with risk analysis, what we're trying to do is that we know there's a risk in anything and we're trying to put it in perspective, like which is the highest risk, which we should really be concerned about, and try and rank them, and so that we only focus on the high risk events rather than the low risk events. So it's a very good tool for literally ranking risks. And when we come to things like HACCP, identifying hazards, and then we've got some sort of measure to say, well, this hazard is likely to occur or it's not likely to occur. So it's very good supporting HACCP plans. But it's more than that. If we're looking at government policy, for example, well, we've got to try and justify imposing a regulation, for example, zero tolerance on listeria. And we need data to back that up. And so what risk analysis does there is it's very good for policymakers because they can say, well, this is a real risk, it's a high risk, the likelihood of occurring is X, and so it needs to be addressed. And also it's a very useful tool to focus on what's important in the chain. So, for example, if we're looking at leafy greens, obviously they're grown in the field, then they're processed and they're sold in the pack. At any point in that process, they can become contaminated. And so what we need to do is find out, well, where is the highest risk? Is it on the farm? Is it in the processing plant? Or is it with the consumer? So all these can filter into risk analysis. As we go along, you'll see that. Now, previously, well, even today, there's two systems. There's a sort of hazard rated system and a scientific based system. So hazard based systems are just identifying a hazard and saying we must have zero tolerance for that. So listeria is a good example. So in the US, there's zero tolerance for listeria, but in Canada and some European countries, we have allowable limits because we base our system on a risk-based system, whereas the US currently is the hazard-based system. And so what risk analysis is saying is that, well, the risk of this occurring is that. So that's an important thing to remember as we go along. So typically risk analysis, if you went to any lectures or into conferences, they'll give you a stream of statistics. And it really is based on statistics, as you probably would have appreciated, because you're always looking at probabilities. But in this lecture, what I'm hoping to do is just avoid the statistics, or they are important. But I think it's more important at the start just to understand the fundamentals, because it does make the statistics easier later. So this won't cover statistics, but certainly there's other sort of lectures out there, textbooks, etc., where you can look at the statistics. But I think, as I mentioned, you've got to appreciate the underlying sort of theory about risk analysis before venturing that far. So in terms of learning objectives, we'll be looking at understanding the reasons for risk analysis. I think I've said a few of them already, but we'll look at that again. And risk analysis is just more than working out probabilities. There's different steps to it, and we'll be talking about the 3 different steps of risk analysis. And really, you've got to appreciate that the sort of function of these different parts and how we actually build up a risk assessment. It's not, as I say, it's not just looking at probabilities of something happening, it's more encompassing than that. And hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to see about how to undertake risk assessment. And as we'll talk about, there's programs out there that can do it for you. And it just gives you the underlying theory. And one important thing about risk analysis is that it's got 3 parts then, the risk assessment, but communication, risk communication and management are also critical, and we'll be talking about those in detail. So in terms of risk analysis, it's a very valuable tool in terms of identifying hazards in a HACCP plan. And as I mentioned, although we're talking about microbial contamination, this goes for all of those hazards, from physical, shavings of wood in a product, or pieces of plastic from a conveyor that finds its way, nails, hair, things like that. Chemical hazards, obviously cleaners, sanitizers, toxins. But we'll be looking at the biological in this I class. And as I mentioned, what we try to do in risk analysis is to rank things, things that are likely to occur, and then things that are unlikely to occur. So, for example, there's 1,400 known pathogenic species to man and animals. And if we're doing a hazard plan, we don't want to consider all 1,400. So what the risk analysis does is able you to get a more representative list of what is at risk, like which one of those pathogens could affect our product. And I'll be using Listeria as an example, but you can apply this sort of same technique to any sort of pathogen. So as we've talked about, life is full of risk. Every sort of event we do has a risk associated with it. So if we're looking at foodborne illness, that's going to be about 1 in 3 million. Much more hazardous is fireworks, 1 in a million. An explosion is even more hazardous, and the likelihood of being involved in an explosion or dying in an explosion is actually 1 in 107,000, which is quite low odds when you think about it. Dying from hot water exposure is 1 in 5 million. An airplane crash is 1 in 10 million. Being attacked by a lion is 1 in 32 million. And contracting variant CJD, which is the sort of form of mad cow disease, it's the prions that get into our diet and we get variant CJD from it. Although there's a lot of talk about it, the actual risk has been calculated as 1 in 40 million. So you can see here that we can see all these events that could occur, and what happens is that by doing risk analysis, we can actually get the probability of them occurring. So foodborne illness is about 1 in 3 million. Contracting foodborne illness from leafy greens, for example, is about 1 in 5 million. So it's very low, but obviously if you're the person in that one, it's not so good. So why do we perform risk analysis? Well, the main purpose is to identify hazards that can potentially occur and the likelihood. So this is critical in, for example, hazard plans, because we have to identify hazards in hazard plans and justify our choice, or justify why we shouldn't have a hazard. And as I keep saying, risk analysis gives you that sort of measure, some real evidence, rather than a subjective judgment. You can actually put down real values. So in a hazard plan, it tells you which hazards are going to be critical and which are less critical, and you can justify why you shouldn't consider them. And also what you can do, though, is you can target resources. So the leafy green example is good. You know leafy greens can get contaminated at any point in the chain. So where should we put our resources? Should we put them on the farm? Should we put them at the consumer end, or put them in processing? In food safety inspection, we have obviously a lot of food processing plants and very few inspectors by relative measure. So we've got to think about, well, where's the high-risk foods? Which are the high-risk plants of processing facilities? And what risk analysis does is to say, well, factories or facilities that process deli meats, so it's ready to eat, is going to be more risky than, say, somebody processing leafy greens. And so if we're inspection, we should put our priority into that. Another example is a baby formula facility. Obviously that's very high risk, susceptible population, devastating consequences. So we would put our inspection resources towards that rather than, say, for example, an ice cream factory. For food safety programs, obviously identifies the risk, what people should be looking at and controlling. And food safety interventions, a bit like we talked about, where do we put these interventions? How effective do they need to be? How many log reductions of a certain pathogen do we need to achieve to have a safe product? So risk analysis is all these encompassing things. Now, when we think about risk analysis, we think it's just like working out odds, but it's more than that. We've got 3 parts to it. There's risk assessment, basically what is the risk, how big is the risk, what can we control and what do we need to control. And the important thing is science-based. It's called risk-based system. Now, the alternative to that is a hazard-based system, where we basically say Listeria is deadly, ban all Listeria from all products, and that's called a zero tolerance policy, which operates in the US for many pathogens. Whereas in Canada and some Europe, for Listeria at least, yes, certainly have zero tolerance for certain high risk products, but lower risk products have allowable limits, and we'll be talking about that as we go along. So it's a science-based system, which is very different from the hazard-based system. Risk management, well, what can be done about the risk? Is there anything we can do to mitigate it? And one very important thing, which I think is the hardest part, is risk communication. How do you express the risk to consumer stakeholders without alarming them, but at the same time making sure they're aware of the risk? So we'll be talking a lot about risk and communication towards the end. And like I say, that in some people's eyes, that's the most difficult part. The actual management part and identification part is the easy one. So this is just a cartoon. Basically, risk perception then, or identifying the risk. Well, obviously in this case it's this rock teetering at the edge of a cliff. Risk assessment is the discussion or analysis, saying, well, what's the likelihood of it falling? And risk management is saying, well, if it does fall, what are we going to do? Wisely just run away, I guess. Now, we talk about sequential, but in actual fact, it's like an evolving circle. Risk assessment involves a hazard identification. What is the hazard? Characterization, well, essentially, does it grow? Does it die off in the product? Exposure assessment is, well, how frequently are we exposed to this hazard and what levels? And is those levels going to cause illness? And risk characterization, essentially, what parameters can control. Then the risk management part is saying we've identified the risk, but then how do we manage the risk? Do we have intervention methods? Do we have preservatives? Things like that. And then risk communication is this basically communicating the risk to those stakeholders or high risk groups. And so it just like all flows, and literally it's evolving. New hazards come up, even processes we put into risk management, for example, the administration of zinc oxide instead of antibiotics actually can result in different risks. So it's an evolving sort of being. It's like HACCP, it doesn't stay still. So let's do the first step then, that's risk assessment. So in risk assessment, what we're trying to do is, one, is identify the hazard with our particular product. And as I mentioned, what we'll be doing is looking at Listeria deli meats as an example, because it's a relevant example and it's good to, but as I said, any sort of pathogen, you can use the same approach with any sort of food system, but this is how you would go around it. So identifying the hazards associated with your product, then looking at the exposure assessment. So with exposure assessments, what we're doing is saying, well, how frequently is this product consumed, and what type of levels do we expect, and is it a high risk group, babies for example, baby formula, or is it a low risk group? And so then we talk about hazard characterization. What is the probability of a certain dose being present and then causing illness? And all these goes into what we call the risk characterization, which sums up all that data we've just talked about, but we'll take it one step at a time, just for ease. So in terms of risk assessment, then what we have is that we have to identify the hazard, the pathogen, the foods, and the sort of high risk groups. Then we've got to think about, well, okay, we've got a product that could be contaminated with Listeria. Let's talk about salami, why not? Can the pathogen grow on salami? Well, with salami, it's fairly low water activity, fairly high acidity, so it's a lot unlikely, but more neutral products it would. So we've got to say, well, is the pathogen there, and can it actually grow in the conditions we put it under in terms of storage and handling? Then we talk about exposure analysis, which is the likelihood of exposing to an infectious dose. And as you probably guess, that's dependent on how frequently the food is consumed. For example, deli meat is very frequently consumed, caviar not so much, and the infectious dose, because we talk about limits, microbial limits, but if you eat a lot of a product, then obviously there's more chance of acquiring an infectious dose compared if you don't consume so much. And the dose response analysis, like how severe is it? For norovirus, for example, we know we get 24-hour flu, if you want to call it that, usually non-lethal, but for Listeria, well, 1 in 3 people die. So the response analysis is very different between different pathogens. And the overall risk assessment is risk characterization. So, what is the risk of encountering these dangerous levels and causing illness? And we'll be talking about that as we go along. So, risk is basically how lethal is the hazard and how frequently exposed. The more likely we're exposed to it, obviously, the more risk we've got of acquiring illness. So let's start off then. So we've got our sort of product or whatever we're trying to look at, and we're going to first of all look for hazards. So for deli meats, for example, we know from history that we've had listeria outbreaks linked to deli meats. We had the big one with Maple Leaf Foods back in 2008, and we've had a few since then and a few before then. So when we're looking for hazards, we look for historical link to food. So listeria in deli meats, eggs and salmonella, beef and E. coli 157. So outbreaks are good for that, but you've got to look at other considerations as well. So for example, we rarely get botulism cases. There's only about, if we're 3 or 4 a year, if that. But even though it's not very frequent and we don't get many outbreaks, we know it's very severe. Basically, botulinum kills you. So what we have to think about is the severity, but also the long-term symptoms. So for example, Campylobacter, yes, it does make you fairly ill for a week, but it's got these secondary symptoms, Guillain-Barré syndrome in that case. Salmonella causes arthritis. E. coli 157 causes kidney failure, which you need dialysis in the long term. So all these things have to be considered. The end consumer, essentially, are we looking at consumers that are old, young, or is it right across the board? We have to consider that. And the growth and tolerance characteristics of the pathogen, for example, how resistant is it to acid or heat? Does it grow? Things like that, as we'll talk about. So we've got to identify the hazards of concern, and as I mentioned, you can take it from sort of historical outbreaks, but you also can look in scientific literature. So for example, people do surveillance studies, for example, human parasites in leafy greens. So we don't really know what the prevalence was. So somebody did a study and they said, well, yes, you actually do get parasites in leafy greens. So that means you have to consider it as a hazard. You can look at databases. The CFIA, for example, have a hazard database which you can refer to. You've got certain products and it'll list the hazards associated with it. Government agencies sometimes give indications of what the hazard should be. So if, for example, patchouli in apple juice. So what the government said is that patchouli can occur in apple juice and you have to make sure it's there at under regulatory limits. But other times you just get expert review panels. So expert reviews will just literally come up with a discussion saying, well, for deli meats we should consider listeria or something else or whatever it is. So all these you get from outbreaks, you get from the literature, you get from databases. Government agencies might have a policy, listeria policy, which is very significant. Or it's just basically some experts review panel. So Enterobacter sakazaki, for example, that was looked at with formula milk, even though the outbreaks are very rare. So as I mentioned, we'll use meat as a processed meat as an example. And so when we think about the hazards associated with processed meats, listeria comes up, but also salmonella. Clostridium perfringens is important in things like ham, so we have to consider that. And pathogenic E. coli, because historically we've known that E. coli has been linked to deli meats. It was a big outbreak in 2007 in the UK linked to that. So these are the hazards we have to consider. And as I mentioned, when you're doing a sort of hazard plan, you might use an extended list and you've just got to justify why something's a hazard or it isn't. So that's why you would do this. So then you've got to do the characterization. You're saying, well, how virulent is the pathogen? Well, we know listeria can cause listeriosis, which has got a 30% fatality rate. We know E. coli 157 can cause death by hemolytic urinary syndrome. Salmonella, yes, it does make you sick. Sometimes it can be lethal. Sometimes it's not. Perfringens, it'll give you a bout of diarrhea, but no real long-term effects. So the virulence is important, and as I said, the risk groups are important, especially if you're a very high risk group, the pregnant, the young, the old. And what is the relationship between hazard level and harm? Like, how much do we have to consume to cause illness? So in the case of E. coli 157, you only need 10 cells in some case to cause illness. For listeria, maybe 10 to the 2, 10 to the 3 per gram. So this is a relationship you have, so you've got to characterize it. So if we look at listeria as an example then, what you have to do is first of all say, well, we know listeria is associated with ready-to-eat processed meats. So who's exposed? Well, everybody eats deli meats, don't they? Well, apart from vegetarians, I suppose. But the elderly do, the young do, the immunocompromised could, and the pregnant do. So pregnant women do. And we know from history that yes, listeria and ready-to-eat meats go together, and so there's been lots of outbreaks. So we're justifying that hazard, saying yes, we have to consider it. So then we look at, well, does the pathogen grow? Well, we know from our sort of growth models that anything above pH 4.5, above water activity of 0.92, at 1 degree C, and extended storage all would promote the growth of listeria. However, high acid below 4.5 or low water activity below 0.92 or freezing, that and short shelf life, well, that's going to be less of a risk. And this is what we have to write down and put into our model later on. So in terms of virulence, we do have sort of two broad subdivisions of Listeria monocytogenes, one being invasive and the other being non-invasive. And so the invasive one is the ones that lead to listeriosis, which are very virulent, and non-invasive are the ones that give you gastroenteritis. Now, you could, for example, say, well, let's just consider the invasive ones, but really, all Listeria monocytogenes, regardless, it's all treated the same way. And then we look at the severity of the illness. Well, yes, listeriosis gives a 30% fatality rate, which essentially means that it is going to be very severe and therefore high risk. But then we have to look at the dose relationships. So we do a dose relationship curve, and so what we have is the probability of causing illness compared to the actual dose. This isn't CFU per gram, this is log CFU per dose. And as you might suspect, when we look at high risk groups, such as the elderly, pregnant, immunocompromised, the dose required, the probability of causing illness is less than that of a healthy person. Obviously, if you give a dose, sufficient dose to a healthy person, they will contract listeriosis, but it's much higher because of the immune system. And so what we have in this dose relationship then is the probability of causing illness, 1 being absolutely certain, 0 being unlikely, and therefore we can figure out, well, this is the sort of dose that we have to consider as dangerous. And we can then tie this back into microbial criteria, and also when we're doing our growth prediction models, what we have to avoid. Obviously, if we go up to 10 to the 10, that's when things get a bit dangerous. So then we look at exposure assessment. So we know, for example, the dose that will cause illness. And so what we're looking at now is saying, well, how often would we get exposed to this hazard? And more importantly, what is the frequency, and what is the volume of product we have? As I mentioned, think about deli meat versus caviar. Caviar, we're not going to eat very much of it and very infrequently compared to deli meats, where we'll probably eat very high volume very frequently. So what we have then is in the exposure assessment, look at the frequency and extent of ingestion of listeria, for example in deli meats, and very often a lot of the data is not available. Basically, how do we know how much people eat of deli meats and what is the dose? So what we have is we have to use our best guess. So these best guess are estimates, and this is what we come into this quantitative and qualitative risk assessment, which we will talk about later. So in terms of risk assessment then, what we look at is not just the end product, but we look at each point of the chain, because we know each point of the chain contamination might be introduced. It might be actually reduced, i.e. it might be decontaminated. So the sum of all these points in the chain, which basically adds to contamination, decreases contamination, or doesn't do anything, has to be considered. And this is how we look at, say, well, how much will end up in the end products, etc. So this is an example with deli meats again. So it's a fairly simple chain, this one. We're starting at the food processing plant because we cook deli meats. And so what we have then is we have our product here, and some products are going to have a growth inhibitor, such as diacetate. Other products want preservative free, so we'll have no growth inhibitor. And in addition to that, what we have is that we're going to have some products that are sold in the pack, whereas others are going to be sliced up at retail and then displayed and then just sold over the counter. So the thing is to remember about this, you all have different sort of risks of not only being contaminated by listeria, but obviously supporting its growth. So we might start off with a low level of listeria, but if it doesn't inhibit growth, then obviously it can grow to high levels or dangerous levels. So we've got different risks, and this is going to really relate to how much contamination is on the product. So the most safest product is ones with preservative in, because we know we can't grow listeria, and which is pre-packed, because if it's pre-packed, it's not going to be exposed to the environment, and we should be fine. Now the higher risk one is that we have no growth inhibitor, there's no preservative, and we're going to slice at retail. We know from our sort of studies, our scientific studies, that at retail we get cross-contamination, it might be improper sanitation, there's more risk because it's not strictly regulated as much as a sort of food processing plant. So that's going to have a higher risk of having a higher loading of listeria, and we know from our dose-response relationship that the higher the dose, the more likely illness is going to be. So this is how we actually look at the different points in the chain and identify which, is it safe just to say, well, let's just go with pre-pack with growth inhibitor, or is there some leeway in there? So what we have is this cumulative fraction. This cumulative fraction is a statistical term. It's essentially the probability of a certain value. For example, in this value, it's going to be the loading of listeria occurring. And from our data then, we know pre-packed is fairly safe, so we know these are the sort of data points we have from our sort of prevalence study, and based on that we can say, well, it's going to be, if we do get positives, it's going to be fairly low. Now at retail, because the higher risk of listeria contamination, we can consider, this is our cumulative dose curve, and this is the sort of probabilities of encountering these levels. So from our sort of data, the highest level we found when we did our sort of survey was 2 mpn per gram, and so this gives you the probability of getting these lower values from that. So what it's saying, this curve basically is saying, well, is it normally distributed or not, or is it, and what's the probability of getting that level of contamination? But we can't just think about, well, retail, it's going to be more dangerous because we're going to get exposed to listeria. But the other sort of side of it is that deli meats sold over the counter have a very short shelf life, whereas pre-packed materials have a shelf life of something like 60 to 70 days. So in this sort of relative frequency is that ones that are retail packed typically will get consumed within days. People buy them, store them for a very short time and consume them, whereas the actual pre-packed products can go up to 60 days. And so with time then, even though we have low levels of listeria in the pre-packed product, because of the extended storage time, it's possible they could grow. So you've got to think about that. So we've got our sort of dose relationship, we know what the hazard is, we know what the infectious dose is, and now we're going to characterize that hazard. So this combines all the information we have, and it's the final part of the risk assessment, and it gives you a complete picture of a risk. So there's basically a lot of stats involved, and it comes out of a probability given a certain scenario. So these scenarios are built up then, and essentially it's a bit like a decision tree. We have a risk characterization, exposure assessment, and these all feed into the risk characterization. And so the questions are: is the exposure sufficient to warrant a full hazard characterization? You might find, well, it's so infrequent at such low levels that we don't need to worry about it. Or alternatively, you could say, yes, these are dangerous levels. It is going to be severe and it can kill people, especially the immunocompromised and susceptible groups like the young and old. So we have to consider that as well. Now, as I mentioned, we have different types of risk assessment. We have the qualitative and quantitative. So the qualitative essentially is what we had before, when you haven't got that much data, because all you can say is saying, well, it's low risk or high risk. There's nothing in between. So it's a bit like the zero tolerance policy. You either have zero tolerance or you don't have zero tolerance. This is usually when there's no real data to fill in the spaces or insufficient time for fuller risk assessment. And these are usually based on expert opinion. So, for example, somebody could start up saying, oh, well, hepatitis A is going to be a really high risk in foods, even though they haven't really got the data for that. But they'll just say it is or it isn't. Now, what's much more informative is quantitative risk assessment, because this gives you a sort of probability of something occurring. And so, for example, you place scenarios on a single point, say, well, we've got 100 CFU per gram of listeria in our product, so what's the probability that's going to cause illness? And so you get these sort of probability profiles, and you can use these to justify microbial criteria or whether something's a hazard or not. And a lot of it is there's information missing. You're basically trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. So we get Monte Carlo modeling, things like that, and simulations, and we'll be talking about those as we go along. So when we're looking at quantitative risk assessment, then we get numbers. These numbers increase risk per serving or risk per annum, and this is critical because you're differentiating, a bit like the example of caviar versus deli meat. With caviar, well, we might have a high risk per serving, but the risk per annum is going to be very low because we don't eat caviar every day. Then we rank the risks, and we have what we call uncertainty curves, which enable us to establish the probability of a hazard. So, this is a typical model then. So we have dose at consumption from the exposure assessment model, and we have dose response function. Basically what would happen if we have a certain level of listeria in a sample. And look at the annual deaths per dose interval. So we know that because we know what dose can cause lethal effects. And then we can look at per serving and per annum. So per serving is individual units which are consumed. Per annum is more to do with the frequency of which they're consumed. And as I said, you have to consider everything. So this is where we input sort of correction factors for those that are susceptible. So what you have is you get elderly populations, neonatal populations of intermediate age, which are a bit more robust. And so you can use these to calculate the risk per serving or illnesses per annum. And so taking our sort of deli meat idea a bit forward, this is the sort of distribution we have then. And what we have is then is a prediction of the number of cases of illness. So deli meats definitely come up there. We know deli meats are associated with listeria, and sure enough we have a certain highest number of cases compared to, say, soft cheese or something like that, or smoked seafood, all based on frequency and the ability to grow. So what we're doing here is we're identifying a relative high risk product, and deli meats obviously stands right out. And this is just the same data, based on cases per annum. Deli meats have a high risk of being contaminated with listeria. It's involved in lots of cases. It's eaten frequently, per annum, and therefore that's high risk. Then we go back, as I say, to sort of spreads and things like that, which are low risk. So what it does in government then, it gives them an idea how to rank risks and also where to put inspection resources. And for processors, it says, well, you've got deli meat, that's going to be a very high risk for listeria. So what does it all mean? Well, deli meats obviously do present a high risk with listeria. We've seen that because of a number of cases. Per serving is going to be high, especially to high risk groups. But also what we can do is identify points in the chain where we can control the growth of listeria and reduce the hazard. But we'll talk about risk management later on. So this is, again, how we prioritise risk, saying, well, if you've got deli meat and listeria, that's going to be much more serious than, say, meat spread and listeria. So, as I mentioned, then we've got two different classes, per serving, which are individual units, and per annum, and this illustrates it well. So we know from our sort of data we have, deli meats are a high risk of carrying listeria per serving, so we know they can get contaminated at high doses, and also they're eaten frequently, so they're going to be both in cluster 1 and cluster A in both categories, per annum, per serving. But then we look at unpasteurised milk. So unpasteurised milk we know is susceptible to contamination, but in terms of per serving it is. But when we think about how much raw milk, unpasteurised milk is consumed over a year by the general population, it's right down in this category down here, for the fact it's not consumed frequently. And you can see there's a few other ones there. Smoked seafood, for example, is here. Crustacean is here. Frankfurters are not even that frequently, but obviously more frequently on pasteurised milk. So these are the different ratings, and this is where you get your sort of exposure assessment or consequences from as well. Like, what is the consequence of a contaminated batch of deli meats going out? And as you can see, that's high. But if you've got contaminated raw milk, then yes, per serving is going to give a case, but does that mean it's going to cause a widespread outbreak? And usually the answer is no, because raw milk's consumed by a very narrow population. Now, that's fine. So how do we do all the mathematics? Well, fortunately, we don't need to do the mathematics because we've got programs that does it for us, all the statistical analysis. And one of the best ones, if you want to endorse anything, but there are others, is the FDA IRIS model. So this is freely available. There's a link there for you if you wish to download it. And I won't go through it in detail because we've got a very good tutorial there. But I'll just show you the different components and how they just go into what we've said. Well, model inputs, for example, is, well, what's the hazard, what's the pathogen, what's the food product, what's the process, does it kill, does it allow the growth, does it do nothing? And then we can play these risk scenarios, saying, well, if we've got a contamination level of A, what's the consequence of that? How big is the risk of an outbreak? So when you go into the program, it'll give you a lot of different hazards and a lot of different foods. And for example, peanut butter was associated with salmonella outbreak a few years ago. It was a very big one. It involved a big product recall. So that's basically put into the on the list. And there's other ones as well, soft ripened cheese, things like that. So then we think, well, peanut butter, well, salmonella has been implicated. So let's think about salmonella. So we'll just add the salmonella pathogen as a hazard. Then we look at what we expect the distribution to be, and we look at a piece in distribution, even distribution, and we're looking at acute exposure. So this is where we get one massive dose, not like, for example, mycotoxins, which accumulate over time. We're saying, well, this is what happens if we get one dose of salmonella. What would be the outcome of it? And then we put in our sort of expected sort of limits then, what's the lowest level we're going to have, what's the highest level we're going to have, and look at the adverse reaction. So 100%, the probability, that's what we're looking for. And so we put in our sort of product name then, and we look at, well, what's the frequency going to consume and what volume, so we need to input that into the mass. We're looking at acute, and we're looking for annual consumption because it's we're looking to say, well, over the year, what's the probability, not per serving, per annum. And then we put in the number of occasions that's going to be consumed per year, not by one person, obviously, by the population. How much, what's the value of the per serving? And these, usually this is where your guesswork comes in because there's no way you're going to know how much people have. And the body weight, because this is more down to size. So dose per body weight will give you an idea about what the infectious dose could be. Then you're looking at the unit mass, so how much is going to be consumed, what is the initial loading, because that's our microbial criteria. So for example, if we're doing salmonella and we decide just to do plating, well, that's not going to be very sensitive, is it? But we have to go for the worst case scenario. But if we do enrichment, then we can say, oh, well, it's going to be very low level, because if it's above that level, we're going to find it. And so that does it. So the initial concentration then, which again is a distribution, it's not just one. And then you look at the process, saying, well, what's this process going to do? Will it decrease the levels, increase it? So you think about heating, for example, exposure to radiation. Like, what would be the reduction in that? So you can include that into the equation. And then when you've done the sort of number crunching, or the program's done it for you, it'll give you an idea. Basically, based on the initial dose, the volume constructed, the dose response curve, and it gives you this sort of disease days. These are days lost due to disease, so 63.2, total illness is 3,320, based on this frequency of consumption. So from this you can see obviously that is 3,320 okay, is it an acceptable risk? And that's what you have to decide. It seems a bit high to me, that. So then you can go more detailed about different populations, and you talk about days lost due to illness. Some others say days of life expectancy reduced. So all these are like figures, not obviously absolute, but give you an idea about the severity. Like if you saw a very high number of days lost, that means the illness could be very prolonged and have secondary effects. And these are all built into the model. And the FDA program is only one of them. There are other programs as well. The CFAA have their reference database, ICAR have some, and the SWIFT quantitative microbial risk assessment tool, all very similar. They're just basically based on different algorithms, and some have more data than others. So as I said, a lot of the times it's a best guess. It's like looking into a crystal ball. It's why you do Monte Carlo simulations and everything. But certainly the FDA program is as good as any out there. Okay, so we know our risk. We know what levels, doses we have. So what we're going to do about it, how we're going to manage this risk. Well, obviously, in terms of risk management, prevention is always better. So if you have HACCP systems in place, prerequisite programs such as sanitation, GMPs, that's going to help. If we look at niches, so for example drains, deep within slicers, things like that, where these pathogens hang out, we can prevent them getting established, we can prevent the product getting spoiled. We can look at preservatives, for example, diacetate, other preservatives like that to prevent the growth. And when we put that into our product, we can do the risk analysis again and suddenly say, oh yes, Listeria can't grow, so the probability of it causing any illnesses is much lower. Intervention strategies, high pressure processing, for example. Before we spend $1 million on a unit, let's just do the risk analysis. Say if we can reduce it by 5 logs, what does that do to the probability of having an outbreak? And sort of in terms of the industry and government, what they could do is sort of risk management. So, for example, raw milk in Canada, it's illegal to consume not consume it, but certainly sell it or distribute it. And so that's a policy based on risk assessment, saying, well, if you don't let the population have raw milk, then you're going to reduce the number of cases by X amount. And so you bring in regulations, or associations can give guidelines to say, basically high risk groups shouldn't eat sprouted seeds, things like that. So in terms of risk management, you look at regulatory codes and guides. So those are issued. So for example, in sprouted seeds, there's no real regulatory codes, but in raw milk there is. Regulation is that you have to pasteurize it. You have measurable limits, as in, well, what's the worst case scenario in terms of illnesses? How low do we need to get our Listeria prevalence before the risk is acceptable? You can have compulsory, so that comes down to pasteurization again. Basically, you have to pasteurize your process. you have to validate your process to cause a certain reduction in pathogens such as listeria. You focus on inspection, so as we talked about, maybe an ice cream plant not going to be closely inspected compared to a deli meat factory. You might need to educate and train people in terms of control and sanitation, how to do sanitation correctly, how to monitor it, and at the very least or very last, hopefully, you can exclude high risk groups. So, for example, this is where you would put a health advisory out for sprouted seeds and pregnant women and elderly, things like that. So these are all managing the risk, either by preventing it, controlling it, or avoiding it. So when you look at sort of risk management, you'll hear a lot of terms being put about, and these are called risk-based metrics. So these are how we assess if we're managing the risk effectively. So one is the food safety objective, and really what this is, a food safety objective is the sort of frequency or levels of a hazard at a point of consumption. So if it's at this level at a point of consumption, then we can be pretty sure it's going to be safe. So for example, for listeria, some products are 100 CFU per gram at the point of consumption, whereas others are zero tolerance. And then another term is the appropriate level of protection. So as we said, there's risk in everything, and there's two things we could do. We could say, like in the US, zero tolerance. It doesn't matter if it's pasteurized beer, it doesn't matter if it's deli meat, it doesn't matter if it's anything. If it's got listeria in, then that's going to be an instant recall. So acceptable level of risk is a bit like what we do every day. We drive, some people go skydiving, and they make those choices on acceptable risk. I guess nobody wants to go to the death in a skydive, but people accept the risk and they'll do it, whereas others people won't. So acceptable risk is similar to that. Now the performance objective is really, as we've talked about, in the chain we have points where the contamination can increase, other points where they can decrease. And what the PO is saying, well, if we know the levels of, for example, listeria is at this amount at the primary production level, then we should be safe. Or is it this amount midway through processing, we should be safe. So that's what the PO is. And the performance criteria is essentially what must be achieved in an intervention to control the hazard. So the obvious one is things like pasteurization. We know we have to have a 5 log reduction of coccidioides in their time for that. So PC is a performance criteria, and then process criterion. If we stick to pasteurization, it's saying what's the time and temperature, for example, to meet that PO, i.e. how much is residual after pasteurization, etc. And the sort of last term, but important term, is saying, well, what should we set as a microbial criterion? Because we do testing in food processing, we test raw materials, we test within process, and we also test end products. And so what we're trying to say there is, well, what is the criteria? Is it 0? Is it 100 CFU? And that tells us what we should be doing. So just to give you an idea with deli meats again, an acceptable level is 3.2 cases per million. That's based on the fact listeria is everywhere. We can't stop contamination, or we can minimize it, but we can't say it's 0. So that's an acceptable level, saying, well, yeah, we can accept 3.2 per million, even though if you're in the 3.2, it's not going to be too good. And for certain products, leafy greens, for example, we're allowed 100 CFU per gram at the point of consumption. So that's not once it's left the processing plant, that's actually looked at the point of consumption, the best before date. And so these are the sort of figures that people have, and obviously different hazards have different values. So just to give you an idea about risk management, how they do it in the US, as I say, they've got a zero tolerance policy, but they've got 3 alternatives. So this is where the governments or these bodies give you ways to manage the risk. So alternative 1 is where you've got a post-lethality treatment. It could be impact thermals, pasteurization, it could be high pressure processing, and it's also got an antimicrobial agent, for example diacetate. So when you've got those 2 in combination, your risk is going to be very low. Now you can go to alternative 2 where you've got one or the other. You've either got this post-lethality treatment or a preservative used in combination with a good sanitation, And so that gives you alternative 2. And alternative 3 is essentially you just got good sanitation, but you might have a lethality treatment, but you haven't validated it. You haven't got evidence saying, well, this gives you so many log reductions of listeria. And so if you're in alternative, that puts you in alternative 3. So you might think, well, alternative 3 is an easy one, isn't it? Because you don't waste money on validation studies, and you don't have to do anything of it, like get an intervention step. But it's not quite the story, because depending on the alternatives, depending on how much scrutiny you put under. So if you've got alternative 1, which is the lethality treatment antimicrobial, you essentially get inspection. You have to do testing fairly infrequently. 2 food contact surfaces per line for 6 months. But if in alternative 3, then that's 1/4 contacts per month, depending on the size. So, and that's mandatory. So what you lose out on in terms of when alternative 1 in terms of expense, you do make up for in having a safer product, obviously, and less inspection, less focus. And the FDA are a bit different. The FDA inspect things other than meat, and they tend to look at things differently. But USDA obviously is more relevant to meat. So that's risk management. As I say, risk management is based on your risk assessment, and you've got to get to a certain level. You've got to have if you've got interventions, they have to achieve a certain log reduction. So we've managed the risk, but now we've got to communicate the risk as well to those that are going to be affected by it, the population, etc. So it's very challenging risk communication, basically because well, especially in the media. I suppose we'll use the media as a good example. That's where most people get the information from. You've got conflicting evidence. Experts, academics, for example, one say it's high risk, one say it's low risk. Industry will say, well, there's no risk here, and the media tries to sometimes hype the story, but other times not. Really the media tries to give a balanced overview, but even they're getting conflicting evidence, and they're very good at communication, but they might not know the science. So you get these mixed messages, and the important thing is, as we'll talk about as we go along, is there's no such thing as zero risk, and we'll see why that is the case. You can't just go on TV and say there's no risk here. You've got to put it into context. And the thing is, a lot of these issues we talk about in food safety are technical. So when you talk about toxoplasma in fresh produce, well, certainly people might not know about toxoplasma, don't know how infectious it is, things like that. And you've got to come over this consumer apathy. So, if you have a lot of food safety stories in the news, they'll say, oh, well, it's just another story, isn't it? Trying to hype it. So consumers can be pretty apathetic sometimes. So what we do with risk communication is we're trying to communicate risks to the stakeholders, try and put things in perspective. But what we try to do is do it scientifically. We don't do it just by saying there's nothing wrong here, there's everything safe, don't worry about it. You have to be sure what you say, because if you say it wrong, it can have big consequences, we'll see. And a lot of people say when they think about communication is put it on a website or a fact sheet, or let's do a workshop. But the problem with these methods is in workshops they're for industry, which is better than fact sheets and websites, is a lot of emotion. You've got to get the mood of the emotion, like is it serious or is it not. If you just put something on a website, there's no emotion involved in it. You can't get feedback from the consumer if they are concerned or not, and it's a very not so good way of translating information. Very good for information that's not critical for sure, but in an outbreak you would not just put on your website, don't worry about anything, and we'll see why that was in the Excel foods. So in crisis time we have to be up there. If you're a processor, you've got to say something. If you're in government, you've got to say something about an outbreak, and you've got to be fast. And we'll talk about the Excel foods event later, but that was a stone wall of silence, which if you don't fill the vacuum, somebody else will, and usually that other person might not have the same sort of point of view in terms of is it safe or not safe. So it's very good to be fast and adequate. You've got to define who's going to do the talking and what each one person's responsible for. Conflicting information is the worst thing you can have. And the important thing is your initial communication, you'll probably have to say without all the facts being there. And that's critical because you don't want to say it's safe when you know, well, you say you can't be sure if it is safe or not. You've got to give them a straight answer saying, well, with the information we know now, it is whatever it is. And really, your media these days is the main source of information. So you have to have relations. Who do you talk to? And you've got to be updated on who's actually running the story, and you've got to be able to link into them. You know, you don't want to talk to one reporter only to find out it's another reporter that's actually running the story. So, as I said, the media is out there much more than they used to be in terms of food safety issues. And what triggers media interest is different things. And it's not always a case we get an outbreak and the media suddenly jump on it. It's not quite the case like that. The good sort of example of that is the XL Foods. Now, the XL Foods affair essentially had 27 cases or suspected cases of E. coli 157, and there was an outbreak just a few months later in New Brunswick, which was linked to E. coli 157 with lettuce and actually caused 24 cases of illness. The XL Foods story went for months and months, really big hyper media exposure, whereas this New Brunswick of the leafy greens didn't. It was a story, half a sort of web page on one of the news websites, but no real media interest. And the reason why of the differences is that in the XL Foods was someone to blame, and we'll talk about who was to blame later. There was a lot of cover-ups in that sort of XL Foods, and they came out later on. Certainly high-profile companies. XL was certainly the second largest meat processor in the country, so they were pretty high. Or if you're an individual, you know, obviously a celebrity, you're going to be in for it. The conflict, you know, people like it when there's conflict, the media does. And in the population, like if it's just a farmer's market, it's not going to be really worth running the story. But if it affects everyone, especially if international, like the XL did, it affected everyone in Canada and some in the US. So that's big, and a strong visual impact. So 157 gives you that because it gives you a picture of people, especially young and elderly, that are very sick, fighting for their lives. So this is really where the media spark up, and I'll cover the story. So if you do get this, you have to have a communication plan, and it's best to have this before an outbreak rather than during an outbreak. So you've got to have a plan saying, well, what message we're going to put out there, how we're going to put it out there. And very importantly, you've got to listen to the concern. So some outbreaks, the consumers might be totally apathetic, they might not be concerned, but other outbreaks like the XL Foods, the Listeria maple leaf outbreak, people are very concerned, and you've got to show you care. That's the point. You know, it's not a cover-up. You've got, and we'll talk about Mike McLean, who was the president CEO of Maple Leaf Foods. The reason why he successfully handled it, because he demonstrated that he cared about everything. He put his hand up and said we were responsible, and he put a lot of emotion into it, and that really made a big difference. So in terms of a plan, then you've got to have a plan before you event occurs. So it's good to do scenarios in this case. You're saying, well, what you're trying to do with the communication, you're trying to inform somebody, you're trying to say, yes, there is a risk here, you're trying to alleviate the concern. And that comes to the message, like what are you trying to say in that message? What's the purpose of it? And the important thing is you've got to advise people, you know, what can they do about the risk? Can they do anything? Like, should they wash the leafy greens? Should they heat up the deli meat? So should they avoid it? Things like that. And the thing is, any sort of plan, you've got to accept ambiguity as the facts come established. So you've got to be upfront in terms of saying, well, this is what we know, this is what we don't know. And the sort of the secret of good communication is you've got to keep it simple. You know, people have to understand it. If you don't understand it, you might as well not be saying it. Timely, certainly, it's got to be at the right time. You can't have a wall of silence, but there again, might not want to jump in too high if you know there's no real crisis going on. It has to be as accurate and consistent. That's the key thing. If you're caught doing contradictory statements one after another, that makes you look bad. Your credibility goes. And you've got to repeat the message all the time. You know, repeating isn't bad, but it has to be consistent and accurate. unless you get new facts, and then you've got to say, well, there's new facts come up, but don't give sort of conflicting. And you've got to look at the outcome then. Do you want to change an attitude? So if you think about GM foods, for example, genetically modified foods, people want to try and change it, and they go round trying to do that. Or you try and just say the understanding, saying, look, we know listeria is a risk in deli meats, and this is the actual risk, and these are the facts. Or behaviour, you're trying to say, well, people shouldn't keep drinking raw milk, they should try and change it. So you need to establish trust and credibility, as I mentioned, and this takes time. But as I say, Mike McLean in the Maple Leaf outbreak, he built up trust and credibility from the get-go, whereas ministers, as we'll talk about, politicians might not be as good as doing that. But once you've lost that, basically you lost everything. So in terms of the message you're trying to impart, then you've got to say, well, what does the consumer need to know? Well, they need to know the risk. What would they like to know? Well, for example, they might want to know what's the symptoms of listeria, what's the consequences, and the other thing about it is likely what they're going to get wrong. And so when there was this listeria outbreak in 2008 with Maple Leaf, it was on the news saying, well, listeria's got an incubation period of 70 days. And so everybody was getting really worried, saying, oh, do you mean to say I could be feeling really well up to day 69 and suddenly get listeriosis on day 70? That's basically not true at all. It's a progressive sort of illness. So that's an example of likely to get wrong. So you're informing them, and you've got to defend your message, because people will challenge you about that risk, and this is why risk assessment is so good, because you can bring out figures, and you have to be consistent. If you're caught changing sort of viewpoints, saying something's safe and then not safe in the next breath, you're not going to look very good, lose credibility. So what can people do about the risk? When you're on a media interview, the last question you always ask is, what can consumers do? Well, do consumers need to look at a certain product code, for example, a certain label, best before date? How do you reduce the risk? Well, you might say, well, just microwave your deli meat or something like that, or avoid it. And what you have to avoid is to avoid sort of assuring the public something's safe when you don't know. And we'll talk about that in the Excel Foods. And you have to listen. So when you start getting feedback from comments put on boards or consumer comments, you'll have gaps, and you'll be able to identify which is a knowledge gap. So I gave you an example about listeria and its incubation period. You can inform them, and so what you can do is you can literally just ensure that those knowledge gaps are dealt with in your next message, and also to avoid biased commentary. So you might think, well, these medias are really being bad to your company when they shouldn't be. So you can go on the attack then. And I said, really what you've got to look at is the emotional side of it. If you go on to a media interview smiling and talking about people dying of listeria, it doesn't go down too well. But there again, in some points, basically it might not be a case, it might be just hysteria. And so you've got to get that general feeling, but you've got to have this sort of feeling for the risk perception, and is it correct, or is people exaggerating? So there was a survey in the news about parasites on leafy greens, and they were saying 1.9% were positive for Giardia. And people say, well, is that really risky or not? And the reality, the study didn't know if it was live or dead Giardia, so it's probably low, but you have to get that feel for what consumers feel about it. So as I mentioned, you've got to build trust, and you build trust through transparency. You're hiding nothing, you've got accurate facts, you've got to be concerned, and we'll talk about when that doesn't happen. And you've got to get the emotion of the situation in the midst of the listeria outbreak with people dying. There were tragic stories about grandmas dying, etc., like that. And as we will see, it didn't go down too well when the minister started making jokes about it. And you've got to demonstrate credibility. You're basically saying, look, this is credible information, transparent, on your side. So how not to do risk communication is very good by Minister Ritz, who's the Canadian Minister of Agriculture, and he's been there since 2007. And the only reason he's really kept his job is because he's developed international markets. But in terms of foodborne illness outbreaks, he is the worst person to have uh, at the front of a ship. A year after he actually took up office, there was the maple leaf outbreak. So in this maple leaf outbreak, there was something like, I think, 40 deaths, thousands of people affected. And so during press conferences, he would make comments like "death by 1,000 cold cuts." And when he heard about someone actually dying, or one of the first patients dying, he was trying to say, "Well, I wish it was Wayne Easter," which was an opposition MP in Nova Scotia, I think it is. So I think as you see what we've told about, this is inappropriate. You had people who were affected. You had a population who didn't know if they'd eaten those cold cuts or not, and he was making these comments, which wasn't reassuring. And you would expect, for after that, he would have learned how to handle sort of food-borne illness outbreaks a bit better. Well, a few years later, in 2012, we had the XL Foods incident. So in this XL Food instance, essentially, if you have to do it briefly, is that this produces ground beef and meat and beef trim, and so beef meat, ground beef and meat trim is used for various meat products. And essentially what we had is a breakdown of the inspection service. They weren't really closely monitoring the plant, and the actual plant management they had a nice asset plan in place, but they weren't following it. And so what was happening is E. coli positive trim and meat was being sent out not only across Canada but the US. And because of the uncertainty, because we started getting cases of E. coli 157, they started recalling all the product from months back. So it was the biggest recall in history, of Canadian history, that is, 1.5 million pounds. It went on for months and months. So this was the sort of backdrop to it. And the owners of the XL food plant, the Nielsen brothers, they just did this wall. The outbreak had started, and they just had a wall of silence. They weren't talking to anybody or anything. But they did put a recorded message on the website, essentially saying our products are the highest quality and safe. Basically they didn't have any evidence to suggest that. It was quite contrary, and so their message wasn't good. It didn't show any empathy, and it was misleading. They did have a sort of late apology, which I'll talk about in a bit, but only after they sold the plant to the Brazilians. And they were basically out there deaf. They had no communication person there, and it's always good to have a communication person, not dedicated to communication, at least somebody who can actually work on it. And as I mentioned, eventually they did come out with an apology, but it was after they actually sold the plant to a Brazilian company, and they were saying, "Oh yes, we take all responsibility." Well, it's easy to say that now. They should have said that right at the start, and they didn't say anything. And one of the brothers who owns the thing, I don't think he ever appeared on camera at all. I think just one of the brothers did. Now, the CFIA weren't doing much better at the outbreak. They were giving mixed messages. First, they said that meat wasn't distributed, then they say it did, and then they said there's no cases, and it was cases. They did have good transparency as the outbreak went on, to be fair with them, but they did disasters. So Minister Ritz, for example, was kept out of the picture because I think people couldn't trust his sort of comments. So they sent him over to Alberta whilst the politicians talked in Ottawa. And he did try a press conference, but it was cut short. The reporters were asking too many questions, which reporters do, obviously, but it's a bad sign. If you're whisking away a minister who's supposed to be controlling everything, that doesn't reassure anyone. And again, he had these inappropriate quotes as well. So the first inappropriate quote is saying, well, look, no product was released to market, only for a few hours later to say that 4 confirmed cases had started coming of 0157. At some point he went to a lunch, and he was quoted as saying, "We had some great Canadian beef here for lunch. I don't know where it come from, I don't care. I know it's safe." He didn't know it's safe, and saying he doesn't care, that's not very sympathetic to consumers. So as I said, he had a rough ride. He was kept out of most of it, but really what it is the lessons of how not to communicate. And the CFIA, the government actually was fairly bad as well, because the government started to distance themselves from the CFIA. They were saying, well, it was their fault. The government have got no controls in asking for a recall. It's down to the CFIA to do it. And really it was a disastrous. There was inquiries, and really it does built up into this new modernisation that we'll be getting. Really helped that along, and they lost. Although Canadian consumers are pretty apathetic sometimes about food safety, the number of not very confident increased dramatically after the outbreak. Now, what happened though is that a new team, this JBS, which is a Brazilian company, one of the biggest one, they came in as white knights, and they were transparent, they were open, they were saying these are the facts we know, these are what we don't know, this is what we're going to do about it, and they gave this sort of reassuring hand, even though JBS is there sort of skunks in the cupboard as well. But it illustrates a contrasting thing, the contrasting attitudes and way forward. So I'm hoping in this lecture I've told you about risk analysis and how it's applied. We've talked about the three components to it, and really risk-based systems are the way to go, because this is where you can get the actual probability rather than a hazard-based, which is in the US. Yeah, not all are going towards a risk-based system, but it's important to know to differentiate. Hazard-based is saying, well, the hazard is there, therefore it's high risk, therefore zero tolerance, whereas risk-based gives more perspective. Okay.